The war in Ukraine rolls on. Russia is steeped in realism, and the West and Ukraine are steeped in Hollywood scripts. That's probably about the most pleasant and honest thing that I can say, because when you look at the actions and the words of the Russian side, when you look at the actions and the words of the Western/Ukraine side, it's really hard to come to any other conclusion than that. And we're not just talking about talking heads or people who are primarily just somebody who's advocating for one side or the other. In most cases, we're talking about government officials, people who are supposed to be responsible for making rational decisions that have reasonable chances of producing something positive for their side. And it's nearly impossible to have a good outcome for your side if you're dealing with a view of the world that's a Hollywood script, meaning that you wrote it. You just decided, here are the realities because that's what I want. So I'm going to make actual actions and policies based on a belief that this fiction that I just wrote is what actually exists. There's just no chance for that to work. And we're seeing it play out like that. To try to help us understand, especially from the European perspective of how that's literally playing out on the ground right now, we have the amazing Alexander Mercurius, co-host of the Durand YouTube channel, and a great fan of this show. Alexander, welcome back to the show.
And a very great fan of this show, if I could say. Thank you for introducing me, Daniel, and I'm delighted to be here today.
And we're certainly happy. I always look forward. Every time I see you show up on our calendar, I can't wait for this show to come up, and never disappointed. I'm sure this one isn't either. And let's just kind of take a look at, first of all, the concept that I'm talking about here from your perspective. And you've been at this from the very beginning, and you've got a number of sources and from probably both sides of this conflict. You've been seeing what's happening on the ground. You're looking at the maps. You're looking at where things are going. You look at arsenals in the West and where they are. You look at arsenals in the East. How do you ascertain the situation of which side, in your view, is actually closer to reality?
Well, the one that is closer to the reality, unequivocally, is the Russian side. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt about this. I mean, obviously, there is always, in any war situation, and we are in a war situation, occasions when even the most realistic people engage in wishful thinking, and you do find that on the Russian side. Sometimes they think they're doing better in a particular place than they are doing. But overall, if you're talking about the political leadership, and by the way the war is covered in their media, they have a much more realistic understanding of it. They understand that this is a long, hard slog against a courageous, it's important to say that, and resourceful enemy, but they understand the war well, and they have good reasons for believing what they do believe, that gradually, steadily, every day, the war is getting more and more in their favor, and that they're coming close to victory. In the West, in Europe especially, where of course I am, in Britain, we just don't want to accept that reality. And the reason we don't want to accept that reality is that we have ruled out any possible outcome to the war except a Ukrainian victory. We want to believe that the Ukrainians are going to win. We are invested emotionally, psychologically, politically, very heavily in that outcome. And we cannot contemplate any alternative to it.
And I mean, I just got to ask the obvious question. Why is that? Because, okay, I mean, if this was the first year of the war, I mean, I might roll my eyes a little bit at some of those comments that were coming out, especially from the U.S. side. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken were just two of the biggest advocates, cheerleaders for we're winning, the war is going our way, Russia will definitely lose, all this stuff. I believe from the outset that was not even possible because of the obvious balance of power disparities between the two sides, the manpower pool, the defense industrial capacity, the raw materials, et cetera. And then even when you start adding in allies and their capacities, it was clear that, especially in a war of attrition, as long as both sides maintained political will, one side was definitely going to win, and that was going to be Russia. But this isn't the first year of the war. We're now in the fourth year of the war. How is it that after all of the wreckage of the last 3 years of war, can people in the fourth year still hold those positions?
Well, one of the major reasons why this is so is because there's been a systematic attempt across Europe, and this is difficult perhaps to explain to people in the United States, but there's been a systematic attempt to silence everybody who points to the alternative position. So if you come out publicly and say, well, actually, the war is not going well, Ukraine is losing the war, and this isn't something now, we've been talking about this for the last 3 years. If you do that, then it's taken as a sign of defeatism, that you're on the side of Putin, that you want evil to win and virtue to lose. And the result is that you generally find that it's very difficult to get published in newspapers, to get your letters published if you write letters to newspapers, to appear on television, to speak on the radio. So in a situation where everybody's all the time saying, Ukraine is going to win, Ukraine is going to win, eventually the entire consensus builds around that. And of course, you get all kinds of people who come along, people who present themselves as experts, and they come up with all sorts of explanations as to why Ukraine is going to win, that it's more resourceful, that it's more tenacious, that the Russians are inefficient, that their armies are corrupt, that their industrial system is not what you think it is, that their economy is overheating, that the general staff in Moscow doesn't know its job, that our weapons are superior to their weapons. And we have that every single day. Every single day, you will find articles of this kind. There's an article today in the Financial Times, for example, which talks about Ukraine's enormous superiority in drones and how the Ukrainians are always ahead of the Russians in drone warfare. So, eventually that becomes a self-reinforcing consensus, which it's very difficult to break through and for people to see beyond it. Now, I think in the cracks, in the corners of government, in Whitehall, in Paris, in the defense ministry there are people now who are starting to see that this isn't really viable and it isn't working out like that. But it's still politically very difficult, and if not just politically, but socially very difficult to come out and say so.
I think one of the reasons for the ability to maintain the fiction now into the fourth year of war is because there still hasn't been an overwhelming Russian victory. They haven't, plowed up to the front gates in Kiev. They haven't taken any more major cities, and I think that allows the fiction to continue on without actually thinking about the ramifications that, okay, well, if you want your side to win on the Ukraine side, somehow you're going to have to reverse what's going on here. But they don't think that far through. No. And Gary, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball here. We're going to actually pull up what was going to be the last one, but it perfectly fits here. Really, just giving an example from yesterday on the American side as to what the mentalities and what the claims are. This is General Ben Hodges, who is making some of the very claims that you just suggested here about how, well, the Russians are kind of weak and they're kind of having some problems, but the Ukraine side's getting better.
After 11 years of war, Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine. Even though they had all the advantages in numbers, and even though the United States, especially recently, has failed to provide the intelligence and capabilities for Ukraine that we should, Russia still cannot defeat Ukraine. They cannot knock Ukraine out of the war. And I think reports that somehow Russia is gaining, that's just not accurate. I mean, it's been 8 months since Ukraine went into Kursk, and only now is Russia finally getting closer to pushing Ukraine out of Kursk, but there still are Ukrainian troops inside Kursk, and Ukraine has now moved into Belgorod. So I think what we're seeing is a determined resistance by Ukrainian forces. Their defense industry is growing while at war. Russia, meanwhile, has enormous economic problems, and I don't know how much longer they can keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, man, any day Russia's just going to fall apart and collapse, and I don't know, they'll be hoisting maybe the Ukraine flag in Moscow in a year from now. Who knows? this kind of nonsense is passed. And of course, he being a four-star general, no one questions it. The media doesn't question it. Most people who watch it don't question it. And they see that the line hasn't moved that much. So I guess they can plausibly suggest it. However, this is one of the maybe even the biggest failure on the Western side and the Western mentality. And I talked about it on a show earlier today. I had Andrei Martyanov, Russian military analyst, really emphasized this earlier this week, which is that Russia is not fighting war the way the West does. We fight it where it's everything's success or failure is measured in territorial acquisition. If you gain ground, you're winning. If you don't gain ground, you're not winning or you're not succeeding. And if you lose troops, well, then you must be eventually losing. But Russia's not measuring territory per se. That's a byproduct. They're fighting an attritional war. And if you're fighting an attritional war, even this area of the Kursk that he mentioned there, it has been 8 months since Ukraine first went in there. There's still a small toehold of a few forest belts that are still occupied by Ukraine troops. What he doesn't acknowledge or maybe recognize is that the Russian side is content with that because Ukraine continues to feed troops into that cauldron, and the Russians continue to use firepower and limited troop movements to continue to kill them. So the war is being won by Russia, not on the territory, but on the manpower, which keeps doing this. And at some point, the Ukraine side could just collapse.
That's exactly correct. And in fact, it's not even something that is difficult to work out because the Russians themselves talk about this. I mean, they fight an attrition war because that is their way of fighting war. They've always used attrition as a major part of the way that they conduct war. Now, I am not somebody who is an expert in military history, and I'm not served in the militaries, but I've now spoken to quite a few people who do, including on the Russian side, and I've read books about how the Russians conduct war. This is the way they're hardwired to fight war. I mean, they always win ultimately through attrition, and they know how to husband their forces. They know how to use industrial warfare to a much greater extent than we do. They are able to, they've connected their army on the ground to their industrial system much better than we tend to do in the West, because their political and military and economic structures are geared to these outcomes. And of course, the thing to always understand about the Russians is that the ultimate objective is not to capture the other country's capital or to, to raise the flag over the, the parliament building or anything of that kind. It is to achieve total victory. It's a rather more tough concept than we have. They are usually willing to negotiate along the way, but if they achieve victory, it has to be a total one. And to do that, you need to break the will of the side that you are fighting. And the way you do that is not just by defeating them in battle, but by basically destroying their army, by making it impossible for them to continue to resist in future.
And that is certainly appears to be the path they're going on. But that's also, especially from the West, not the Ukraine, but from the Western, point of view, if you don't see a lot of land going on and you don't pay attention to how many Ukrainian men are getting fed into this maw of just getting their bodies ground to mush, if you don't pay attention to that and you only pay attention to the line, you can we can keep going like this. This is cool. But there is coming a point to where if that manpower pool gets down to a certain level that no one can predict, I can't either, but there is a level somewhere before zero to where the viability and the sustainability of the force as a whole can crack, if not outright collapse. And then all of a sudden, you can literally drive into the countryside because there won't be anybody left to offer resistance. That's what we haven't seen yet. And that's what the Western mind, I don't think, can come to grips with. But, we're talking about, you mentioned the issue of negotiations. Yeah. So the West, I think, has this idea that, okay, we don't like where this has gone. So let's just stop. right here on the current line of contact. Just y'all on the Russian side, just pretty much do whatever we tell you, and we'll just stop fighting for now. And who knows, maybe later we'll restart it or something like that. But you're the evil one. So anyway, we'll just stop it right here, and we're going to find out if you're serious about wanting peace. You say you do. That's what our diplomats are saying. So here is Marco Rubio, who was asked in a recent interview. I think it was on the 3rd or 4th of this month, and they said, "Hey, you're trying to seek a ceasefire. You already have that agreement to try and seek a ceasefire with the Russians, but they're still attacking. What do you say?" Here's what he responded.
Here's what the president wanted to do. He wants to end this war, and he wanted to test it very early in his administration. Is it possible to end this war on terms that are acceptable, obviously, to both sides? Because you can't end a war unless both sides agree. And that's what we're in the process of finding out. We will know soon enough, in a matter of weeks, not months, whether Russia is serious about peace or not. I hope they are. It would be good for the world if that war ended. But obviously, we have to test that proposition. So we're working through that process. We had a visitor, that Mr. Kirill was here this week. Had a chance to sit down with him. He met with others. He'll take some messages back, and the message is the United States needs to know whether you're serious or not about peace. Ultimately, Putin will have to make that decision. The Russian Federation will have to make that decision. I think the Ukrainians have shown a willingness to enter, for example, into a complete ceasefire to create space for negotiation. At some point here, fairly soon, not 6 months from now, the Russians and Putin will have to make a decision about whether they're serious for peace or not, and I hope they are serious. So it would be good for the world if that war ended.
So let's examine that aspect of this for a minute, Alexander. He's saying we'll find out if they're serious about peace, and it's implied in his comment there that stopping the war where it's at right now, and then we'll move forward here. But you just said that your analysis and assessment is that Russia is looking for a total victory, either through negotiations or through military conquest. And so if we're talking about the potential for a ceasefire and an end of war negotiations, then what Rubio seems to be thinking doesn't seem to be in line with what it appears Moscow's thinking.
Well, absolutely. And this is, I think, where it's a bit baffling, because it's sort of as if the Russians haven't explained this already very clearly and very openly. The Russians have set out what the terms that they would settle for are. They've also made it very clear that these are not, as far as they're concerned, maximalist terms. They could demand much more. What Mr. Rubio is saying would make sense if there was indeed some kind of balance on the battlefield, some kind of equivalence on each side. At that point, you could come along and say to each side, well, look, you've fought yourselves to a standstill. It doesn't really make much more sense to go on fighting in this way. Why don't you come down and sit together and talk and agree a ceasefire, and then we can see whether we can settle whatever differences you have together on the negotiating table. That isn't the reality of where we are at the moment. The reality is that Russia is grinding Ukraine down. It has no particular incentive, therefore, given that it wants to achieve its objectives. The objectives it set out at the start of the special military operation, and which they have reiterated ever since. They have no incentive to move from those, and they will not do so. And to say that we'll know in a few weeks' time or a few months' time whether the Russians are serious about peace, it's to misunderstand the reality. Just go and listen to what they say. If you listen to what they say, you realize you don't have to make those tests, because they've explained it all already.
And I guess if we're wanting a negotiated settlement to come about, then either we're going to meet those kinds of terms, or then the war will continue on. So there shouldn't be any confusion about, unless you're reading from a self-made Hollywood script where the Russians somehow end up losing, or at least saying, all right, well, I tell you what, we'll just stop here and you can keep everything on your side. We'll keep this stuff here. You can keep your government in place in Kiev. You can keep your armed forces there. You can keep on stuffing them full with ammunition and weapons. That seems to be what he has in mind, or what he's trying to get, but it's rather different than the reality. Or is it? Because in the very next day after he made that comment, he was also asked about the reports that Russia appears to be massing, and these reports came from Ukraine, by the way, from Zelensky himself, that Russia is massing for a potential two-front offensive in a big way in the Sumy area and in the Zaporizhia area in the south. Interesting. I detect a bit of a change in what Rubio's saying here. Let's see what you think.
Ultimately, this is a war. Right now, things are going to be blowing up in Ukraine and inside of Russia because there's still a war going on. That's what we're trying to end. Okay, if we have a true ceasefire, which is what we wanted, a complete ceasefire, nothing should be blowing up. But the Russians didn't agree to that. They wanted a partial. And then obviously when you get into these partials, that's one of the reasons why we didn't push for a partial. We'll take it because it's better than nothing. But one of the reasons why we didn't push for a partial, because there's always disputes about what are you hitting and what you're not hitting. But in the end, this is still a war, and we want it to stop. The fact that religious sites are being hit, or energy sites are being hit, or civilian sites are being hit, that's why war is a bad thing. And that's why the president wants to end it. As far as them conducting another campaign, well, then that'll be a very clear sign, right? If all of a sudden we wake up tomorrow and the Russians are launching a massive offensive, then I think that's a pretty clear sign they're not interested in peace.
See, what struck me about that last part there where he was talking about if Russia starts this big offensive tomorrow, then I guess then they didn't actually want peace. I didn't hear anything in his voice of saying, and then there will be hell to pay, or then we'll take these other actions. It almost sounded like he goes, well, I guess then we'll know. How did you see that?
Well, exactly. That's exactly what it was, because ultimately it's very difficult to see what can be done by the United States to change that dynamic. If there is a big Russian offensive, which I think probably there will be, we might even have seen the first moves preparing for that offensive. Then, well, that will shape the battlefield. And it will shape the negotiations, if there are going to be negotiations going forward, because it will put the Russians in a better position than the ones they are in now. This is getting this whole discussion about ceasefires is getting it all wrong. We shouldn't be talking about pausing the conflict, freezing it there. The Russians, as I said, have rejected this, and they are continuing to move forward. And the war is continuing according to their plan. What we should be doing is looking for some means to persuade the Russians to stop before terminal damage is done to Ukraine itself. Now, that means not talking about ceasefires, but addressing the issues that the Russians have brought up many times ever since the start of the special military operation. Talking about the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, the situation with the Russian Orthodox Church, the position of the 4 regions, which is now absolutely crucial. Ukraine's future status within, whether it's neutral status, but also providing specific guarantees so that the Russians can be confident this time that promises that Ukraine will not join NATO will on this occasion be honored, and the kind of security guarantees and security structures that would make a peace last. That is the sort of discussion that would probably take things forward. And just saying, well, we have to have a ceasefire and we can defer all of that until later, isn't going to work, because the Russians will say, well, we've been there before. We tried that. That was what the Minsk agreement was all about, and it didn't work. And we're not going to be fooled again in that way. And why should we anyway? Because we are winning the war. So this is, I think, what people in Washington need to understand if they really are serious about trying to find a negotiated end to the war, which I think there should be, by the way. I think there should be an attempt to bring the war to an end and to preserve Ukraine and to save lives. But it cannot be done in this way that is being suggested now.
Well, it cannot be done if you're looking at the Hollywood script that you wrote, as opposed to the realities on the ground that you articulated, that the Russian side continues to articulate. And it's one thing if you're a retired general who's, I think he lives in Germany, General Hodges, I think he lives in Germany, so he didn't have access to classified information anymore. So he's just saying whatever he thinks from over there. And maybe even it's another thing if you're a diplomat like Secretary of State Rubio, maybe he personally doesn't understand about how a lot of common military things work. But if you're actually an active serving 4-star general commander, U.S. commander of U.S. European forces, General Chris Cavoli, if he's saying stuff that looks more like it's from the script, then we have a bigger problem here.
Russia has been throwing a lot of troops and taking a lot of casualties, particularly in the last month or two. Has that stalled across, you go from Kharkiv down to Kherson, basically the front, or are there places where Russia's making progress?
So Russia has stopped making progress in Kursk right now. They haven't been able to dislodge the Ukrainians. If we come all the way down the front along Chasiv Yar and the towns in Lugansk, if we go down to Pokrovsk in Donetsk, the Russians' attacks seem to have petered out. They've decreased in the last couple of weeks significantly in number, but the size and scope of the attacks seems to have petered out as well. The Ukrainians are in good positions. They're in good defensive positions. They've improved some of their readiness and manpower situation. They are indeed producing large numbers of Russian casualties. In a couple of minor places, the Ukrainians have actually gained some ground back, but I do not see the Ukrainians being in imminent danger of collapse. I do see the Russians struggling to make the kind of gains they were making last autumn.
So you have there's the four-star generals say, yeah, the Russians have petered out. They're not making the gains they were. They're struggling. As you pointed out, that others have said, oh, their economy is wobbling. It's on its last throes. I mean, it's been said 100 times. And the Ukraine side's getting better. They've solved they've improved some of their manpower issues. They've got good defensive positions, implying that, yeah, you can just keep on going for a long time. So if you've got the four-star general who does have access to classified information saying these kinds of things, then what is any policymaker or any diplomat going to think on the Western side? And yet that's contradicted by today's news out of Kiev, where they report, or actually yesterday's, where they report that the Russians are accelerating attacks almost all across the front. So one has to wonder who's got the intelligence accurate and who doesn't.
Well, this is a massive question, and I sometimes struggle to understand and provide an answer for it, because what General Cavoli said makes absolutely no sense now, when, as you correctly say, the Ukrainians are saying that in fact there's an offensive underway, that the Russians are actually increasing the tempo of their attacks and are gaining ground. But it wasn't true when General Cavoli said it. He spoke about the battle for Kursk, the fighting in Kursk, as if it was all in some kind of a standstill. I mean, from my understanding, he said that just after the Ukrainians had been basically expelled of nearly the entirety of the pocket in Kursk that they had been holding. Now, to say that this is somehow, a war at standstill, when just the previous couple of weeks that outcome had happened, seems to me, well, I mean, I have no words for it. Delusional, it would be one word, but I mean, it can't be delusional, because he presumably has that information. I mean, it's denialism of some kind is the only word I can think of.
And boy, if he were the only one in denialism, that would be bad, given his position there. But he's not. And it's not just the Western European leaders. It's not just the U.S. officials. It's also, I don't know if you've heard of this guy named Zelensky running the Ukraine side. In his video that he made yesterday, he started off by saying, hey, listen, all I need at this coming Ramstein meeting that they're going to have, I think it's Friday of this week, I just need 10 Patriot batteries. No problem. We'll just give me 10 more batteries. That's all I need. And this.
Другий пріоритет на Рамштайні – це конкретне опрацювання незмінності підтримки в цьому році. Стабільність та передбачуваність допомоги для України – це те, що розчаровує агресора і реально стимулює до дипломатії. Потрібно знищити цю спокусу у Путіна, коли він сподівається, що підтримка України зникне. Не зникне. Підтримка буде продовжуватись. Нам потрібен цей сигнал і незмінне постачання оборонної допомоги.
So he said there, I don't know if everybody could read some of the words there at the bottom, but he said, listen, I just need, in addition to 10 Patriot batteries, that's all, which he's been trying to get for a long time and nobody's given them up, but he still wants them. And he needs a signal that he's going to get consistent, more ammunition, weapons, fuel, everything that you need to continue fighting war from the West indefinitely, presumably. and that if Putin thinks that he can wait us out until we just die, he's got another thing coming. But listen, I just got today a private text from somebody who used to be in his administration in Kiev, who said our money is almost finished at a state level. There is no stable financial aid, which is what he just said he wanted. It is likely we are finished financially even before the end of this year. So I don't think endless war is even possible. I'm so let's see. I don't want to skip that part there. Something else. And I've had news that shows that we don't have enough people that were even to draft. We can't offset the losses. We've tried to pay a big bonus to guys 18 to 25 years old, but that's in a few. It's trickling, a couple of hundred only. The people are exhausted, but also there is no motivation to fight. I think that there will be an escalation by the Russian side, maybe in the end of April, 1st of May, and she doesn't think that they can survive. That's what someone who's looking at the reality on the Ukraine side said, as opposed to General Kavoli and Volodymyr Zelensky. Question is, how much longer can this fiction go on?
Well, it's a good question because, of course, I can't give a date or a timeline exactly when this is going to end. But sooner or later, the reality is going to crash through. And it will probably happen very, very suddenly. And that will make it very difficult for an awful lot of people to understand and accept what has happened, because they've lived inside this bubble that we've been listening to throughout this program for so long that when it finally collapses, there will probably see a lot of disorientation and confusion from many people here. Now, Zelensky, I think, probably has more understanding of the reality than he lets on. But of course, from his point of view, because his political future, and maybe more than that, is tied to at least continued Western aid and a continuation of the war to justify it. I think that he is deliberately spreading this myth that, all we need is 10 more Patriot batteries. I mean, ludicrous things. Endless supplies of weapons, endless supplies of aid. If we do that, if you give us that, all will be well. We will prevail. And unfortunately, going back to what we were saying earlier in the program, there are far too many people in the West, including in government, who want to hear that, who want to believe Zelensky and want to believe that what he is saying is true, when it isn't. I mean, it absolutely isn't. The reality, from everything I've heard, and I have got my own sources in Ukraine, is exactly like what you said, what that person who contacted you said to you about the actual situation there.
Yeah, I can partially get that issue about, I want to have, my political masters. I want to keep them happy. I'm a political animal. But at some point, and you kind of implied to it there, you got to worry about your physical life as well. And I'm not talking about from Russia. I'm talking about at some point, if the truth of this finally gets, penetrates through to the Ukrainian people, and especially all the loved ones of these potentially over 1 million dead that have been out there, and they find out that their sons and daughters were continually thrown into this death trap that never had a chance to succeed. And especially in the last stages here, he refused to negotiate and can still continue to throw people into Belgorod or into this tiny little toehold they have still in the Kursk area. All it's doing is getting more people killed and absolutely no possibility for anything else. They may not like that when they come to that realization once the fiction wears off.
Well, that's absolutely correct. That is entirely right. I mean, he does have that hanging over him as well. I think it is too late for him to change course. I think at some point in the last 3 years, probably in 2022, he committed himself to a certain course, and he doesn't know how to escape it. And the point is, we can talk about Zelensky an awful lot, and his motivations and why he does what he does, and whether he believes what he says or he doesn't. It's the effect of what he's doing that should concern us, because exactly as you said, what he is doing, the words he is saying, are continuing a war which is killing more and more of his people every day. I mean, the Belgorod operation, which, by the way, I was reading in the Times, has led to Ukraine controlling all of 5 square miles of Russian territory. 5 square miles. I mean, it's risible, but it's also tragic, because think of the number of people who have died to capture and hold those 5 square miles.
Yeah, it's just it's criminal, and to me, it's immoral. I mean, I use a very strong language in that because of the unreality of the military side. Um, so that's the Western and the Ukrainian side. Let me look at the Russian side here. We've been talking about some of the things that's said. I want to let some of them speak for themselves. A couple of very interesting statements made by Lavrov, as he often does, speaking in diplomatic ease. You have to kind of interpret some things, but I think that it's not that hard to figure out some of the stuff he's saying that the West really should pay attention to. I believe this is a video that was just released earlier today. He's here explaining the Russian view of how they think this war started. They have long said that the Ukraine side started this, and it's usually mocked and laughed like, well, of course you invaded in February 22, and now you're saying the Ukraine side did, ha ha ha. That's not what they're saying. They admit that they invaded in February 2022, but they say it started much earlier than that.
Having seized power through an illegal coup d'etat and labeling those who disagreed with it as terrorists, this regime launched a real war against them, employing regular armed forces, aviation, and artillery. The West indulged this regime's actions to eradicate all Russian aspects of these lands' history. After all, it was the Russians, such as Catherine the Great, Potemkin, and our other glorious ancestors, who developed these territories, built Odessa and other cities, ports, factories, and plants. The regime that came to power as a result of the coup sought to erase all this from the people's memory in order to obediently serve the will of its Western puppeteers, who have always dreamed of turning Ukraine into a direct military threat to our country.
See, what he's communicating there, in my assessment, is that he's telling the West, this is not just a war we're fighting. This is like the motherland. That's something that Putin has used a lot of late. This is the core issues here are not just NATO, although that was probably the instigating factor, but it's the treatment of the ethnic Russian people that were living in Ukraine, many of which have already been annexed into Russia, but that's not all. But he's saying that your elimination of the rights and stripping the freedoms from the Russian people, to not letting them speak their language, etc., making it hard for them to find a job, those were the things that actually drove us to engage in February 2022. And that means, and that's the way I view it, like your view, that when they're talking about having any kind of a negotiated settlement, those issues all have to be addressed. I can't see any possibility that they will agree in anything close to the current line of contact when there's still a whole bunch of Russian ethnic people on the other side of that line.
Absolutely. I think that one thing that should be made clear is that when Lavrov talks about Odessa, that we created Odessa, that this is Russian land and Russian territory, he is not at this point in time demanding that Odessa should be transferred to Russia. But he does say that the Russian identity of many of the people who live in Odessa, who live on territory that was historically Russian and had always been so, as far back as the 18th century, as far back as the time of Catherine the Great, that Russian identity should be protected and respected. And by the way, as he also repeatedly points out, on this, he has international law on his side. There is, a huge amount of provisions and agreements and conventions that go back well into the 50s, which basically, all reaffirm the right of people who live in their ancestral homeland, which is what we're talking about, to be able to follow and live by the cultures that they have always held. And it is also true, and this is anybody who's followed this conflict closely, really, it is impossible to deny, is that Ukraine has always been hostile to that Russian identity of people who live in places like Odessa. In fact, it's not only undeniable, a rather sinister development in recent years is that this Ukrainian attack on that identity is being justified in certain places, including in parts of the British media as well. The Russians will not compromise on this because for them it is existential. It is, as you rightly said, a part of their motherland. It might not be joined politically to Russia, but they're not going to simply sit by and let Russian culture and be eradicated in these places and Russian people are persecuted in the way that they feel they are.
There was another comment that he made in there that I think is maybe for us in the West, maybe a little bit more important to get, because he's talking about, that was about the issues led up to the war. Now then he's going to shift his focus to where things are right now and where they may go. And he's going to pull some historical issues up, and he's going to make some correlation between what the West has done in the past with Napoleon invading Russia, with Hitler invading Russia, and then now this third opportunity. And he's basically saying this one is going to end like the first two.
All these efforts are crucial to prevent yet another instance of rallying half of Europe, or even the whole of Europe, under the banners of Nazism and neo-Nazism against our country, as is effectively happening now. They started by pumping Zelensky with weapons for a complete victory, for Russia's strategic defeat on the battlefield. Now, realizing that this is not working, they are talking about deploying their own armed forces to the battlefield, primarily the French and the British, who are simply obsessed with this idea. I hope that not everyone has forgotten the lessons of history.
See that last part there? I hope everybody hasn't forgotten the lessons of history, that we will defeat this kind of thing. Now, I think we mentioned earlier in this episode here that Russia's in a special military operation. They're not in an all-out war. I've recently talked to an expert on the Russian way of war, and they said that is not just a euphemism. That is a very specific term that has limitations in it, meaning both in how they operate, what targets they had set, and then how far that they mobilize their nation, both their personnel and their industry. If they go to a full war mobilization, they said that because of the training that they've done over the last 3 years, because when especially a conscript comes in, they come in for a year and then they go back out, and they do. So there's a large pool of people, even from preceding this war, in the millions, that could be mobilized in a national emergency where they wanted to go into a war. My view is that what Lavrov is saying there is that if the West continues trying to fight this, at some point we may go to a full mobilization, and then we may physically defeat Europe, not just the Ukraine side, not even just go up to the Dnieper River, which some are.
All these efforts are crucial to prevent.
So I want your view on that. Do you think that that's what he meant there?
I think absolutely, and I think this is where this the West has got this completely miscalculated this, because they don't understand, or at least they don't want to understand, Russian history. I mean, the Russians, in their own self-conception, have had to face repeated invasions from the West. You talked about Napoleon, Hitler, the Kaiser, you could argue the British and the French during the Crimean War, and things of this kind. So the idea of being invaded from the West is one that is very central to their understanding of themselves. And the idea also that they have to sort of resist these foreign invasions to protect the motherland, to protect Russia, is also very central to their history and to their own self-conception. If they get the understanding, the belief that this conflict in Ukraine is simply another repetition of that kind of invasion, then, as I said, they will respond, and they will respond probably very much in the way that you said. They will regard this as a war against Russia, not just by, special military operation to sort out problems in Ukraine. And at that point, well, if they start thinking of it as a war, then the whole of Russian society will be mobilized. And going back again to the early point
what do you say to those that, and I've seen a lot of these on the U.S. side in particular. I haven't seen whether this is prevalent in the U.K. or not, but in the U.S. side, there's many people here in Washington that say, well, that's just a bunch of nonsense. I mean, they don't have that capacity. I mean, look, it's taken them now into the fourth year of war just to get 22%, kind of like what Ben Hodges said there. I mean, if that's all they can get now, then it's a joke of the highest order to even suggest that they could come up against NATO, because they could never do it. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's, I mean, I can't imagine that the Russians want to go up against NATO or anything like that. And I don't for a moment believe that they want a World War III or anything of that kind. But General Syrski, who was the Ukrainian commander, military commander, has just said that their mobilization potential is 5 million. They have 600,000 people actually in the area of the battle. If they start mobilizing their society and their political, economic and industrial structures are constructed around the possibility of having to do that to a far greater extent than ours are, because that was their history. And that was also the way in which their economy was developed, particularly before and after the Second World War. Well, then, as I said, we would be facing a far more powerful military challenge than we've ever had to face at any point since the start of the Cold War. Now, I don't believe we're going to get that, by the way. I don't think that anybody in Moscow really thinks that we are heading in that direction. And I don't think anybody in Europe really wants to go into Ukraine to fight the Russians by ourselves. We want to go into Ukraine and bring in the Americans and help the Americans to fight the Russians for us. That's what we really want to do. Of course, we never say that, but that's the real objective. So, but nonetheless, we are playing with these very dangerous forces of Russian history and of the Russian psyche, which you can get to know Russians well, are very real and are very much there just below the surface. And this is a dangerous thing to do. Already we have convinced most Russians that we are fundamentally hostile to them and to their country. That is why their opposition to the war really isn't a significant factor in Russia today, because Russian society has consolidated around support for the special military operation. If we take this further, then, as I said, it's possible that this could go much more dangerously than it has up to this time. I hope we don't get there, and I don't believe we will.
Yeah, I certainly hope we don't get there as well. And I have great confidence that your assessment that there's many in Moscow that don't want that either, don't even want to contemplate going that. However, I know that there are others in Moscow that very much do want to do that. And I mean, it's playing basically Russian roulette with nuclear weapons, but there are some who calculate, and I've seen some of these exchanges back and forth shared to me by certain folks. It says that they're like, look, we've been in a special military operation now, and at that level of mobilization of industry, et cetera, for probably 2 full years now at scale. And if they wanted to go to the full mobilization, it would take 6 to 9 months to get there. And of course, they have the manpower. I think Sirski's right. It probably is somewhere around 5 million, probably a couple million that are relatively good quality. It wouldn't take that long to get up to speed. So let's say 6 to 9 months to have an army of like 3 or 4 million people here. If you look at the entire Western side, and I'm definitely counting the United States into that grouping, we're still at February 21st, 2022. We've just a little bit up to some additional contracts to maybe produce a little more ammunition and 155 millimeter, for example, a little bit more in Patriot interceptors, but not a fraction of what you would need to actually fight or sustain a large war. You have the British armies. What is it? The number of actual fighters is maybe one combat division is what I saw recently.
Yes. Yes.
France, around 200,000.
Yes.
Everybody else is less than that.
Well,
Alexander,
absolutely.
we don't have the manpower or the
We don't.
experience to fight a war against anybody right now.
We don't. I must make one absolutely essential point, which is that in order to carry out an effective and successful mobilization of Russian society of the kind that you have described, you would need to convince people in Russia that this was a defensive war, that this was actually a war to defend and save Russia. If they do that, if they believe that, then they will go for it. The way to do it, the way to convince them of doing something like that would be by sending French and British troops to occupy Odessa and talk about no-fly zones and to actually take steps in that direction. That could provoke a very, very powerful reaction. And going back to your other point, yes, undoubtedly, there are people in Russia, in the military, not just in the military, but in wider society, who are saying all the time, why are we allowing this to continue in this way? Why don't we exert more of our power, more decisively, to bring it all to a conclusion quickly? Aren't we, by fighting this war in this way, which is one which, as we discussed, is very much according to our own traditions. But if we fight it in this way, the West sees this as a sign of weakness. They constantly escalate against us. We run risks for ourselves if we do this. We should move much more quickly and much more decisively to bring this thing to an end in the way that we can do. Those voices every day in Russia get stronger. Putin is having to hold people like that back. They undoubtedly exist at the highest levels in the Russian government, in the Security Council, which is the main decision-making body, and of course they also exist in the military.
Yeah, that's a frightening thought. We don't ever need to get there. We don't ever need to go down that path. It should never have happened. I mean, we should have taken any number of off ramps from April 2022 on forward, but we seem to have to try and just ignore the reality because we still are going with the Hollywood script that we wrote instead of the actual one on the ground. But as long as you have Russia on the actual reality on the ground and the knowledge of their power, while we stay over here on this Hollywood script, we may get a Hollywood ending, but not the one like where it's a happy ending, but one like a horror movie. If we keep going down this path, and I really hope that some kind of sanity arrives pretty quick and that we can get this war over with before anything bad happens.
So do I, absolutely. I mean, I still think we will avoid the worst outcomes. I mean, in fact, I'm reasonably confident that we will. I think European society, for example, is strongly hostile to these, adventurous ideas. But the dangers, the risks are there, and they can never be discounted. And we've played with these risks far too much throughout this conflict up to now.
I agree with you. And I think that none of these people, Keir Starmer, whether Macron, Schultz, or Merz, I don't think any of them actually want a war. None of them. But by keeping going down this path, they keep alive the possibility of miscalculation or error, some dumb mistake, some spark comes out of nowhere that just changes everything. They keep that alive. And that's what I worry about. Not a conscious decision, but something stupid or some accident or mistake that plunges the whole thing into a potential for war. And the longer we go down this path, as you just said, we keep that possibility alive.
Absolutely. I agree. I completely agree with that.
Well, we'll leave it there for now, and we're going to continue to track this as it goes forward, especially if there is, as several sources indicate, a Russian offensive that could start in a higher level than it has been for a while. But before the month is up, or the first of next month, we'll be on top of that too. But as always, we're absolutely delighted to have you on, and it's always a real treasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And thank you very much. And thank you guys too. Also want to just invite you, if you want to support us, you can hit that little join button right there. That helps us to continue to have great folks like Alexander Mercurius on the show. And be sure and like and subscribe also if you haven't done that before, because that helps us out more than you may know, and it doesn't even cost you anything. But appreciate you guys watching us. We always do. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.